Hey, 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 good people, good people. Hey, hey, hey. Yes, it's Tommy here. And I was just on with Stavely. We did a Mandela Effect show. And it was a good show, hour and 20 minutes long. Catch that if you missed it. Anyway, all right, so I decided to upload this here. It's a documentary from 1980 on the place of dreams or a place of space forest dreams, the National Air and Space Museum, and that is the Smithsonian, sorry, whatever, Smithsonian Institute. Of course, it's now institution, but all right, so it's two parts here, 29 minutes each part. And I'm going to play this first one. And I don't know, see how it goes. I might talk over it. I might hush and watch. But anyway, it's all to get people interested in space, and going nowhere. All right, so here we go. I'm going to go ahead and play this. I do need to get the screen share set up here. Do that.
I'll never get over it. The fine, pure joy of flying. Back when I was a kid, I dreamed of flying. Now, having flown airplanes for half a lifetime, the dream is still with me. And so what a thrill for me to find in the nation's capital, as a part of the venerable Smithsonian Institute, a remarkable building that was built because people dreamed of flying. A building to celebrate human flight, almost as spacious as the sky itself.
This is 40 years old. Filmed in 1980. 40 years old. We have a place just like this here in Pensacola on the base. Air Museum.
Magnificent. Just magnificent. That's the only way to describe this place. Real airplanes strung up like toys, real rockets standing 70 feet tall.
Fake rockets.
What a place. They've captured not only the story of flying, but the excitement of flight. I've known about that excitement since I was 16 when I first soloed. A lot of people may know me as Cliff Robertson, the actor or the director or the writer, but to tell you the truth, the thing I like to do most is fly airplanes. And I bet as we look around here together, the excitement of flight will rub off on you, too. Let's find out. Why is this museum so popular? Why has it become the most popular museum in the world? I think I know why. I think it's because this place inspires as many dreams as it displays. And maybe because there are so many stories in the story of flight. The story of flight is still unfolding, and every item, every artifact is displayed so it tells a part of that story. Take, for instance, these three machines hanging up here. Ranger, Lunar Orbiter, and Surveyor. Each a part of the story of our voyages to the moon.
Junk.
The transmitted photos and robot claws that dug into the surface, they taught us what we had to know. And the climax of that story Two men step onto the surface of the moon. And the surface they're stepping onto, they've got some of that here too. You can actually touch it. A rock from the moon. It's about 4 billion years old, and it feels, well, it feels pretty much like a rock.
Oh, it's so clear like glass. Oh. That's the moon.
You see it? Yeah, that's a piece of moon. Rub it.
Like the moon rock, there's a bit of wonder to find in
Moon
everything.
crack rock.
Touching a spacecraft that's been in orbit. Seeing the size of these things up close. Standing beneath a real airplane that was once the hottest thing in the sky.
This is the T-2, an airplane built by a Dutchman named Anthony Fokker.
The Army bought the T-2 in 1922, trying for the first non-stop flight across the country.
They selected Lieutenants Kelly and McCready, who were test pilots.
Kelly and McCready, coast to coast in an incredible 27 hours. Behind the linen-covered fuselage, behind the helmets and goggles, behind the roaring propeller, there have always been people. People who knew fear, but were not afraid. Some are remembered clearly, and some much less so. The lonely chance takers, each with a path into the sky. The museum is filled with their historic achievements.
Astro
But
actor.
history can mislead us. Wiley Post's greatest achievement was forgotten. He was remembered for taking off in his famous white monoplane, the Winnie Mae, and flying twice around the world. Each time, he set a new record. But he wouldn't be satisfied until he broke the transcontinental record by taking the Winnie Mae up to an astounding 40,000 feet. Yet, in 1935, there was no technology to keep him alive at altitude. So Post figured it out and took his design to B.F. Goodrich. And this is what they made for him. Wiley Post's forgotten contribution to the technology of flight, the spacesuit. Technology
What?
is a practical solution to a scientific problem. And though the first two suits failed, the third one finally worked. And 30 years later, one of the reasons that Ed White could walk in space was simply that Wiley Post wouldn't give up. This building is here because a lot of people wouldn't give up. Danger, hostile places, hostile critics, repeated failures, still, they kept trying. This spindly-looking device is one of the pivotal inventions in the history of flight. But it took 17 years to get it working right. A young New England scientist named Robert Goddard began in 1909 the research and experiments that would one day lead to the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. His wife's home movie camera documented his many difficulties. But Goddard would not abandon his hopeful view of things. In reporting on one launch, he would write, "It was not a failure. We were simply collecting another valuable piece of negative information." By 1926, he was ready for yet another launch on his farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. The Smithsonian had helped him with funds over the years and had published his remarkable article on how to send a rocket to the moon. But when the rocket here left the launching frame, it flew to an altitude of 41 feet. Still, it was a workable liquid fuel rocket, a splendid step forward. And its basic technology can be found in the great rockets that opened the space age. That's why it's here in a gallery called Milestones of Flight. Milestones don't come easy. The greatest weight that any of these vehicles carried on its first takeoff was the weight of hope. Hope was on the line. Careers were on the line, and lives, too. When Aerodrome number 5 first took off, it would carry on its fragile wings the reputation of a distinguished American scientist. It was 13 feet long, made of tubular steel covered with silk. A dragonfly with a steam engine. And it flew for almost 3,000 feet, launched unmanned in 1898 from a houseboat on the Potomac River. One of the nation's leading astronomers had designed it, Samuel Pierpont Langley. When Dr. Langley became third secretary of the Smithsonian, it was expected that his research would continue. What was not expected was that in his new workshop in the side yard of the institution, he would become obsessed with the dream of building an aerodrome big enough to carry a man. In 1899, the secretary's office received a letter from Dayton, Ohio. The writer, also interested in human flight, would like the Smithsonian to send him all the information it has on the subject. The letter is signed, Wilbur Wright. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1900. Wilbur and Orville Wright arrived from Dayton, bringing the parts for a glider. Their aim is to fly it with one of them aboard to control it, to pilot in the unpredictable winds. But first, they will fly it as a kite. In the next 2 years, they will build and pilot bigger gliders with movable rudders and wings that can be bent or warped at the tips. They learn wing warping by studying the flight of buzzards in Ohio. Dr. Langley also studies the flight of birds, and the government has put $50,000 into his project. 1902. By the end of the season, the summer visitors to Kitty Hawk have made thousands of manned but unpowered flights. 1903. Back on the Potomac, Langley's aerodrome is almost ready. Charles Manley, the engineer, is designated as pilot. Manley's never been off the ground. With their engine installed, the Wrights flip a coin to see who goes first. October 3, 1903. Langley's staff prepares the man-carrying aerodrome for takeoff. Reporters and rowboats have been waiting for months. The Washington Post said it simply slid into the water like a handful of mortar. 2 months later, Manley is ready to try again. Once again, disaster. It was the bitter end of a prominent public dream. Nine days later, without a single reporter on hand, Orville Wright flies. Fulfilling the ancient dream of human flight, the brothers from Dayton, Ohio had finally found that path into the sky.
There you have the elements of flight, the same as we have today on the 747.
Paul Garber, historian emeritus at the National Air and Space Museum, understands the significance of the Wrights' achievement. And he recalls a memorable day in his own life back in 1909.
In the evening newspaper, I read that the Wright brothers that Orville Wright was flying at Fort Myer. I wanted to go. So I asked my father the next morning for car fare. There was at that time an electric train that ran over there. But as I got off of the streetcar there at Fort Myer, I could hear this sound overhead. There was the airplane flying toward me. As it approached me and flew overhead and then turned to go on back down the field, I just stood watching it until finally it landed. I'd made kites as a boy and flown them, but here was this enormous kite with 2 men in it, and the propellers and the engine, and I can still picture myself there. I can look right through a 747 and see the Wright brothers airplane of 1909. They were able to control it in all 3 axes, the vertical and the horizontal and the longitudinal lateral. And with those 3, you can control an airplane in any direction or correct its lack of balance in any direction. So there is what the Wright brothers accomplished. No one had had this 3-axial control until the Wright brothers. This is the important factor in their progress. Let me say it as the Wright brothers did. In September 1908, Century Magazine, they said our first flight was for only 12 seconds, a very modest flight compared with that of birds. But it was nevertheless the first time in the history of the world that a machine heavier than air, not a floater, heavier than air, and carrying a man, had risen from the ground under its own power, had flown forward without loss of speed and with control, and landed without wreckage at a point equally as high as that from which it had started. There is the definition of what is real flight. That means you can get up and go and fly and get there and land safely. And that is what the Wright brothers did accomplish.
They moved their bodies from side to side to control the flight. The left hand was on the stick, and when you get in another angle around here, you will...
To make the story of flight live for the visitor takes a guide with insight. Astronaut Mike
666
Collins,
right there.
this new museum's first director,
On the side
knew
of
the
the plane,
importance of telling the
Look at
story
that.
well.
My colleagues here are a very unusual, very diverse group. When they were challenged to create something absolutely unique, they did it. In fact, they were so successful that last year they played host to over 9 million visitors.
That kind of success
In
comes from a
1980,
lot of
9
work
million
behind
visitors in 1 year. Wow.
It's a matter of the total color of the sand.
Behind the scenes, a broad spectrum of research, a modern phase of an old tradition.
Really, they should be up about
Behind the scenes, an endless concern for clarity. Everything that goes on display must be accurate, interesting, understandable, and reliable, too.
Fake. It's not a globe.
And in the basement, a computer that brings everything in on cue and even tells when a light bulb is burned out. In quiet offices, the skills of curators, people who respect the past because they know it intimately. Who can answer almost any question about aeronautics or astronautics. Other curators have another challenge, the collection and exhibition of art. One of the museum's 23 galleries is an art gallery, a museum within a museum, where the story of flight is seen through the eyes of artists. Two skills are basic to the success of this museum. It takes planning and it takes a sense of drama. Every new gallery is minutely envisioned long before it is ever built. It must handle a flow of thousands of people, and it must create its own special atmosphere. The idea here was to create the feeling of being on the hangar deck of a Navy carrier. They call it the USS Smithsonian. And behind the scenes, another great skill, the meticulous reconstruction and restoration of every aircraft before it is displayed.
right. That's pretty close, Joe. You dip down between that file.
Ideally, when they are done with this ancient French plane, the inspector at the original factory would not be able to tell what was original and what had been restored. This one was designed by the Frenchman who in 1909 first flew it across the English Channel. Louis Blériot was his name. And he flew a Blériot. During that first decade of the airplane, it seemed everybody wanted to get into the air, and it didn't seem to matter much what for. You could take off and just fly around. Or you could take off and try to set some sort of record between neighboring towns. Or you could become a daredevil, like Lincoln Beeching, who flew under bridges and who raced Barney Oldfield at fairgrounds across the nation. And who made the first loop-the-loop ever seen in America. He claimed he could fly anything, even a barn door. But in 1914, the picture changed. A serious use was found for the airplane. In this massive and tragic ground war, the airplane was not decisive. But even in its infancy, its future was clear. The airplane guaranteed that never again would a war be fought only on the ground. The Great War, they called it. World War I. Didn't get the number until later, of course. The museum has captured the mood of those days with this forward flying field near Verdun, France, 1918. Some of the great air battles of the war were fought in the skies above Verdun. You know, if you stand here quietly, you get a feeling of what it must have been like. For 3 years, in the air and on the ground, the Great War had been savage, but inconclusive. And then the Americans mobilized. 15,000 young recruits took basic flight training at home, and 2,500 joined the AEF and sailed to France for advanced training. But our pilots had to fight in English and French and Italian planes. There just wasn't enough time to build an American Air Force. In World War I, we were known more for our songs than our combat aircraft.
Don't take my darling boy away from me. Don't send him off to war. You could get father and brother three. Now you come back on
A lot of fine planes flew into battle in the Great War, but none were more feared than this one. Fuselage was cotton stretched over a metal frame. The engine, a 160 horsepower Mercedes-Benz. The German Fokker D7 was one of the great planes of its time, and everybody knew it, particularly opposing pilots. Some fighters were faster, but the D7 could hold a steep climb and could attack from the rear and below. There was little defense against that. Only the armistice could put a stop to it. The war was over. We had surplus planes and surplus pilots looking for something to do. For a lot of them, the answer was barnstorming. Barnstorming and stunning. The words came into everyday use as this goofy kind of activity became a regular part of American life. You could look up from a fairgrounds any weekend and see a great stunt. To some, it appeared to be a dangerous life. But the barnstormers claimed that the biggest danger was starving to death. Other stunts would be more purposeful. Out in Santa Monica in 1924, the U.S. Army contacts a young man who's just started an airplane company in a barn. They're going to need some airplanes, 4 big ones, to pull off a big, respectable governmental stunt they have in mind. The United States Army wants to fly around the world for glory. Take off April 6, 1924. 4 Douglas World Cruisers take off from Seattle, heading northwest to Alaska. And this This is one of them. The Chicago. Wingspread 50 feet. Length 36 feet. Loaded weight 4 tons. Yes, it was a big plane. A big plane put together by some ladies and gentlemen in the employ of young Donald Douglas in the Santa Monica barn that had once been a movie studio. In Alaska, one of the cruisers crashed. But for the next 5 months, around the world, the other pilots pressed on. 2 Army lieutenants, Lowell Smith and Leslie Arnold, sat in these cockpits, taking everything the weather could throw at them for 27,553 miles. From Seattle, all the way around the world, back to Seattle. But the great Liberty engine of World War I was just not up to a grand adventure on this scale. The Chicago used up 6 brand new engines on the flight. The trip was nevertheless a victory for the Army's dogged logistical persistence. And politically and socially, it was a smash. Circumnavigating the earth for glory, our men were cheered everywhere. But no welcome was more prestigious than the one they received in Washington from Calvin Coolidge. Mr. Coolidge actually smiled during the ceremony, and it was observed that he gestured also. But a few years earlier, with no heroes, another presidential ceremony took place in Washington. Though the world took little note, President Wilson motored out with Mrs. Wilson to inaugurate the first U.S. airmail service between Washington and New York. The president's personal letter would be delivered to Postmaster General Patton, who would travel to New York by train to receive it. This would mark one of the first truly constructive uses of the airplane. Yet, within 20 minutes of takeoff, pilot George Boyle would be lost over Maryland, would break a propeller on landing, and have to be rescued by a mail truck. Those early days were not easy, but the post office persisted. They expanded service to the south and the west. They flew in all kinds of weather. And on the long night flights between Chicago and St. Louis, one of the best airmail pilots would crash twice. But he had saved $2,000 in flying the mail, and in early 1927 he quit and flew west in pursuit of a dream he'd been working on. With the approval of his backers in St. Louis, he would work in San Diego on the design of his new airplane. And the tiny Ryan Aircraft Company would build the plane for just over $10,000. In 60 days, it was rolled out and ready to go. A few days later, when he lands back in St. Louis to christen the ship, he reveals to the press who he is and where he's going. He will fly the Atlantic Ocean in pursuit of the $25,000 Raymond Orteig Prize. His name is Charles A. Lindbergh. At Roosevelt Field in New York, he is delayed for days by bad weather. Then one night, the sketchy weather reports improve. He cancels his plans to see the musical Rio Rita, and on the morning of May 20th, he's ready to go. The Spirit of St. Louis is a flying fuel tank that has never before taken off with a full load. In this cramped, unheated cockpit, traveling alone for 33 and a half hours, fighting his great enemy, sleep, Charles Augustus Lindbergh flew into history.
I wrote a cablegram congratulating him on making the flight and asking him to give the aircraft to this museum. And then I took this cablegram to Dr. Abbott, the assistant secretary. I said, Dr. Abbott, we ought to send this cablegram to Lindbergh. He's got a good airplane and a good engine and good instruments, and he's an airmail pilot, and he'll be the one that's going to do it. Dr. Abbott said, well, now, Garber, he's barely gotten started. I think he's now approaching Newfoundland. He's not even across the ocean at all, and I think this is a bit premature. And yet, kindly, he said, but I'll take it under advisement. And he did send it, and it must have been one of the first things that Lindbergh received when he woke up the next morning after a 10-hour sleep.
All right, so that was part one, and it was actually nice that it wasn't so much about space. Now watch the second one. Will probably be. I'm glad it was more about airplanes than about space. That's refreshing. Anyway, so I hope that this is recording okay, and I guess we'll find out later. But here's part two. I'm going to go ahead and play it. And, yep, that's what I'm going to do. I guess I'll keep that on. We are recording, 31 minutes so far. Wow. Helicopter. Playing something flying over. I don't think loud. A free service of your local library.
Lindbergh had carried to Paris some letters of introduction given to him by the son of Theodore Roosevelt. As it turned out, they were not necessary. In later years, he would say of this moment, I could hardly have been more amazed if I had landed on another planet instead of the city of Paris. President Coolidge sent the cruiser Memphis to bring the young man home.
Lindbergh, baby. Develop that. Imagine that.
Yet, through all the endless hoopla, Lindy kept his head. He also kept the promise he had made to Paul Garber and the Smithsonian about the spirit of St. Louis.
The phone rang April 30, 1928. I picked it up. He said, Paul, this is Charles Lindbergh. I'm going to fly the Spirit of St. Louis into Washington. Is that convenient? I said, well, certainly. So I hurried down to Boeing Field. He came in and taxied up as he landed. And he said, well, here it is. And I said, well, thank you very much, and we'll take good care of it. And he may have said, well, I know that you will. So with the aircraft disassembled at Boeing Field, we put the wing and the tail group in a truck and came into town like a little parade. We came down Independence Avenue and into the east entrance of the Arts and Industries building. And there, very carefully and reverently, we brought it in the doorway and into the North Hall. I had arrangements for suspending it. We put it together there with the help of a working party from the Army and hung it there.
Charles Lindbergh made American aviation respectable, and he was a leader in making it commercial, but also he had an effect on spaceflight. There's a link between the spirit of St. Louis and the Goddard rocket, a link that most people have never heard of. You see, by 1928, the fire chief of Worcester, Massachusetts was saying that Robert Goddard's fiery rockets were a public danger, and he demanded that such tests be banned from the Commonwealth. Well, Professor Goddard had to get out. He needed help, and he got it. He got it from Lindbergh, who is now a member of the board of the Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics. The Mescalero Ranch, they called it. The place where Robert Goddard of Massachusetts became a Westerner. Lindy and Harry Guggenheim came to visit. It was Harry's father, Daniel, who had paid for Goddard's move west. New Mexico was just right for him. There was no fire chief in the plane when he put up a 60-foot launch tower. There was no public danger if a fiery rocket blew up on the pad. Goddard could finally work on a scale that matched his old dream. On developing gyro stabilization. On the turbine pumps that forced propellant into the combustion chamber. On learning to organize the systems of larger rockets.
Tried to keep the liquid oxygen as far away from the combustion chamber as he possibly could. When you put insulation on it, you put weight on it, and his problem was to develop a tank that could hold the pressure and yet still not be so heavy that the thrust of the rocket couldn't lift this thing off the ground.
The thrust of his rockets increased as the years went by, and the rockets grew heavier and more complex. They also lifted higher and higher. By 1935, his A-series rockets were traveling at a speed of 700 miles an hour, up to an altitude of 7,000 feet, to the delight of the Mescalero staff. "7,000 miles to the east, on the shores of the Baltic Sea, another group of men pursued a parallel technology. At Peenemünde, the Germans were working with characteristic intensity to develop their own rocket technology. The Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I prevented Germany from creating an air force, but had neglected to mention rockets. In both fields, the Germans moved ahead in secret. Peenemünde wasn't much like the Mescalero Ranch. It was an industrial research center with a staff of 1,800, under the direction of a young engineer named Wernher von Braun. In later years, von Braun would be quoted as saying, "Until 1936, Goddard was ahead of all of us." Von Braun wrote of sending rockets to the moon. But the products of Peenemünde would land much closer than the moon. On England. This was a less threatening German product in the 30s. To many, it seemed promising. The dirigible, or Zeppelin. They had always been big, but at 803 feet, the Hindenburg was the biggest of them all. In the National Air and Space Museum, there's a reproduction of her control cabin. The helmsman stood ready to turn her to port or starboard. The other steersman maneuvered the great elevators to help change altitude to keep her in level flight. For $750 round trip, you could come aboard and pack your clothes in your spacious stateroom, stroll to the lounge for a drink, lean out the window, and watch the world go by. Even your pets were welcome in the Zeppelins. And your palate was pampered. And a transatlantic voyage on this ship seemed to point a graceful way into the future. The only thing forbidden was smoking outside of the smoking room. The ship was kept aloft by 7 million cubic feet of explosive hydrogen. And it was, in fact, a great floating bomb. Famous accident at Lakehurst, New Jersey was never explained. But the image was etched in public eye forever. The end of the old dream of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Seemed to be a time of tragedy from the sky. Only a few weeks later, in the far western Pacific, the mysterious disappearance of a plane, pilot, and navigator on a record-breaking flight. The pilot had captured the imagination of people everywhere. Amelia Earhart. In just a few years, she had become one of the most famous women in the world. Admired because of her ambition, flying skill, and her courage, she had a remarkably disarming style. Gracefully, she made the point that aviation was going to be for women as well as for men. This is that famous plane in which Earhart flew across the Atlantic, then across the country. This is a sister ship to Wiley Post's Winnie Med, also a Vega, made by a little company started out in California called Lockheed. No more linen stretched over a frame like the World Cruiser or the Fokker D7. No, the Vega was a plywood shell formed in two streamlined halves and then bonded together under 150 tons of pressure. Strength came from the skin itself. A revolutionary design by a young man named Jack Northrop. A few years later, when Northrop left Lockheed to form his own company, he came up with another pioneering design, the Northrop Alpha. The Alpha was a Vega with a low wing instead of a high wing. Northrop made it of metal instead of wood. It became a prime inspiration for all later transport planes. They would all be low wing, all metal, stressed skin monoplanes. And none would become more famous than Donald Douglas's DC-3. The DC-3 was comfortable and profitable. The first plane ever to make a profit just by carrying passengers. Altogether, 13,000 DC-3s were built. By 1939, they were carrying more of the world's air passengers than any other plane. It was, without question, one of the best aircraft ever manufactured. When we found ourselves facing another war, the trusty DC-3 was ready for another role. It would become the C-47 transport, the workhorse of World War II. In this war, the airplane was no longer of secondary importance. It was at the heart of the matter. Tactically and strategically, no move could be made that did not take into consideration air power. This time, our pilots did fly and fight in American planes. An entire industry was built almost overnight to turn out hundreds of thousands of them. Bombers, flying in close formation and protected by fighters, rained decisive destruction from the sky. It was indeed an air war. 10,000 feet up, with flak bursting everywhere on the other side of these fragile walls. A Martin B-26 Marauder on a bombing run over Frankfurt, Germany. For years, this seat was surrounded by screaming danger. This is the famous Martin B-26 bomber called Blackfate. Up forward sat the men who guided her through 180,000 miles of combat flying. They flew her through more missions over Europe than any other American bomber. This was the radio operator's seat. He was one of a crew of 7, and he also fired the waste guns. The eyes of every man who sat here would search anxiously for landmarks, for targets, for flak, for enemy fighters, and damage to the plane. At the end of a raid, coming in with an engine out and the control surfaces riddled by flak, their eyes would search for the haven of home base. In over 200 missions, Flakbait never lost a single man. The crews of Flakbait shared a war that seemed to go on forever. And when it was over, Flakbait herself was obsolete. The B-17 was obsolete, and the whole world had changed. We would become an international power. We would be flying jet planes. And in a few years, pursuing a remarkable new technology based on a weapon we had brought home from Penemunda.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. Let it be clear that I am asking the Congress and the country to accept a major national commitment of scientific and technical manpower.
That commitment was largely made possible by the presence of the man to the president's right, Wernher von Braun. He and his technical staff had come to America at the end of the war, bringing enough rocket components to fill 16 Liberty ships. At White Sands, New Mexico, they helped us develop a national rocket research program, working for a decade, only about 100 miles from the old Mescalero Ranch. (1957), Sputnik. From Russia, a terrible joke that would trigger a vast and elaborate national response.
Now, this is a choice which this country must make. If we are to go only halfway or reduce our sights in the face of difficulty, in my judgment, it would be better not to go at all. I believe we should go to the moon, but this is not merely a race. Space is open to us now, and our eagerness to share its meaning is not governed by the efforts of others. For while we cannot guarantee that we shall one day be first, we can guarantee that any failure to make this effort will make us lost. We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share.
Oh, did you see Uncle Sam with no stripes on his hat?
Time for a great new American enterprise. Men must fully share.
There's Uncle Sam. And he's got no stripes on the top of his hat. That was crazy. I know it's hard to see. Hang on. See there? It's white at the top. That's not how we remember it. There's lots of things, lots of people and stuff Mandela affected in this film. Anyway, yeah, that's not the right way. Remember, it was stripes up top. See, it's just white. All right, let's continue on. I'm getting tired. I'm almost falling asleep here.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
Astro actors.
In a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. It will be an entire nation.
T-minus 25 seconds. Astronauts report it feels good. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
No humans on that. CDI.
Embarked on one of the pivotal journeys of remembered time. The lonely dreamers were not really alone up there. Millions of us shared the dawn. It was as though we had not been left behind. The missions of Apollo. Man traveling fast enough to slip the bonds of Earth, being drawn into the gravitational grasp of another heavenly body. The lunar module breaks away from the orbiting command module for landing.
Oh, sure.
30 seconds. Engine stop. Mode control, both auto, engine command override off. 413 is in.
It was an exciting moment then, and it's the same all over again when you see it in the museum today.
Fooling all those kids.
Eagle has landed.
Indoctrinating them, programming them, and thinking space is real.
And beyond the drama and tension, work. Instruments to set out. Magnetometers, seismometers, spectrometers. It would send back information for years.
It does
6 missions to the surface. 24 astronauts. Men working against time to finish detailed schedules of collection and observation. On the last 3 missions, a lunar rover, letting the astronauts drive 60 miles in all. Only the Americans would think of taking a dune buggy to the moon and parking it there. You're never closer to these voyages than when you walk through the museum's Apollo to the Moon gallery. For some people, these artifacts touch the chords of memory. For others, the Apollo story is unfolding in detail for the first time. The story of 12 men walking on the surface, while 6 men orbited above, awaiting their return to the command module. On Apollo 11, Mike Collins went around the moon 30 times. And when it was time to go, there was always plenty to bring home. Altogether, they brought back 841 pounds of rock, thousands of photographs, and 1 million memories of a fantastic human achievement.
Space Force.
Mike Collins would later write that once the Eagle had linked up with the command module, it would be downhill all the way. And it was.
Well, we got there and back, and this is our spacecraft Columbia. Today it's here on the floor of the Milestones of Flight Gallery, just about 15 feet beneath the Wright Flyer. This was our happy home for 195 hours. It had to give us everything we needed, from Cape Kennedy into space, to the moon and back, and finally into the Pacific Ocean. It's a magnificent piece of technology, a piece of engineering that I became very fond of.
It was a technological miracle. Let us do in a whole new dimension what people have always been doing. Finding out things. The head of the Museum Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, Dr. Farouk El-Baz.
There was a tremendous change from a technological mission into a scientific exploration of the moon. The moon is a very special place to the Earth, very special indeed. We know now that the Earth and the moon were created at the same instant in time and from the same types of materials. The oldest rocks we find on Earth are 3.5 billion years old.
Oh, sure.
And we know that the Earth and the moon were born 4.5 billion years ago.
Oh, sure.
Which means that we have a whole billion years of the history of the Earth that's missing. The moon has stayed nearly intact from the time it was created until today. And since it was made at the same time and from the same materials as the Earth, these rocks from the moon can give us clues to the very early history of the Earth. So we use the moon as a window at the early history of the Earth.
Artist Robert McCall. It is his mural that invites you into this museum. And he sees the Apollo story with another eye.
I wanted the mural to have an inviting aspect somehow. To show space as not a hostile, fearful environment, but one that is indeed welcoming and attractive. It seemed to me that the important thing was to say something very, very positive about the future of man in space. And I feel this. I'm convinced in my own mind that mankind's future lies in space, in the stars, perhaps.
Before we could go into space, it was only natural that we identified space with the distant future. But the so-called futuristic paintings of McCall today represent the attainable. Some of his paintings represent objects that have already been contracted for and built and are being tested. And Skylab is in the sky. It's as big as a Midwestern silo. And men have already inhabited Skylab for nearly 3 months at a time. Like scientists on Earth, they have conducted observations.
Houston, at any rate.
They've gone for a morning jog.
Well, we'd like to see those smiling faces up there.
They've eaten with a knife and fork. And they've even had time to fool around. In other words, they've really lived in this place.
See where they had the storage tank that contained the water. And the boxes around the side, they contain their equipment and supplies that they would need. The water for the shower comes out of this nozzle. They'll spray himself with water.
When people have been soaping up and showering and telephoning and sitting down to a regular meal, well, it's not so futuristic after all. So it's a safe bet that this
Poor kids
generation will
getting
think
all
of
that
space as today
programming.
and not so much as tomorrow. But there's nothing
Like
new
bull
about
crap.
it. The story of flight has always been the story of adjusting our thinking to a new possibility. It's always been the story of going higher, going farther, going faster, going to places we've never been. Why do we go? Well, there's something admirable about trying to do what you think you can do, about spending a life in quest rather than in ease. Perhaps we admire people like Langley and Lindbergh and Earhart and Armstrong and the others simply because they got going. They had dreams and they followed them. And wherever the great dreams of the future may take us, in the air or in space, this museum will be here to tell the story, to reveal what men and women are accomplishing as they venture far above and beyond this homeland that we call the Earth.
Imagine that. '78 when they started filming this. It came out in '80. All right. Well, I hope y'all enjoyed that. That was perhaps the soap was okay with the planes, but space crap, definitely crap. Anyway, yeah, just wanted to share something different. Everyone says they hated that film, then I won't share another one like it, I guess. Again, I don't know. But anyway, I was almost falling asleep a few times in this chair. It's 2:30 here, 2:29. I'm gonna hop off of here and go to bed. And I guess I'll just play this in the morning. I'll just get it ready for tomorrow morning to play instead of tonight. If I could stay up longer, then I would go ahead and. I doubt there's many people up now anyway. So, all right, just sharing something different. Old film. Take care, people. God bless you all. Tell me here. Tell me out. Much love.